Yeah, I'd like to just welcome acknowledge the traditional owners of the land as well. There's an intimate connection between the people who made refugees in their own land and the refugees who have come, most recently. It's always difficult to know where to start when talking about the refugee and Australia's shame, and I think particularly, at the moment as things are unfolding so quickly on Manus Island, and people may not have caught up with that, but this afternoon the fences were pulled down around Manus Island. There's now a desperate protest actually happening in front of the fences, particularly in my compound. People are very, very worried now that they are completely defenceless in the face of the police or of the Navy wanting to forcibly evict them. I think what's happening on Manus Island is a small, but I think a very poignant example of Australia's shame and why there is such shame about offshore detention. And I think what has happened, I think there's been a massive outpouring of support for the people who are on Manus, and I think at various other times, people can get very tired of about hearing about the refugees, and sometimes it's out of sight, out of mind. But I think over the last week, to see the desperate stance that 600 odd people have taken inside that detention centre, and the enormous efforts that one of the most developed and richest countries in the world will go to maintain a barbaric siege against defenceless people, to deny them food and water and power in an attempt to simply force them out of the detention centres into even more safe areas. It's just, I think it's something which is truly shocking to large sections of the Australian community. I know we've been inundated. I'm sure the Refugee Council has been inundated. All the refugee groups have, in terms of people wanting to provide support, for people who are at Manus. And it's a small example, but I think people are horrified to think that the government would go to that extent to do what they're doing to the people on Manus. But it is, I think, a tip of the iceberg, if you like, of how the Australian government has actually treated all of the asylum seekers, all of the refugees in Australia. The barbarity that's been inflicted on people on mainland detention centres really is not substantially different to what's been inflicted offshore. But I think there are some things, and I'll come back to that about why there are some particular things I think about offshore detention which is worth recognising. I think the other thing about refugee policy, I think, is that it's impossible to understand refugee policy in a general sense in Australia, I think, without understanding that it's always been connected with both foreign policy. It's always been connected with domestic policy. It's not the case that there's ever been a refugee policy. Refugee policy has always been an outcome of Australia's foreign policy position and circumstances of its own domestic politics. And I think you can look at that even when you look at the way in which the Labor Party introduced mandatory detention in 1992. And I'm not going to go back in all to the history of Vietnam and the boats that came out of Vietnam and the various responses that there were to the arrival of those boats. Although it's worth saying, I think, that the governments even of those time, and many people have welcomed Fraser's position of welcoming refugees, and certainly of the family reunion. But there was an underpinning even in those days where Fraser took a very different attitude to the arrivals by boat compared to an acceptable planned and orchestrated arrival that was later actually put in place. But to understand mandatory detention in 1992, it really is tied up with the Labor Party's policy at the time over Cambodia, and that why they initiated the mandatory detention and moved to establish mandatory detention was because there were Cambodians who were in detention at the time, and there was about to be a court case which probably would have resulted in that decision to actually free the refugees that were being held under the Migration Act at the time. The Labor Party very quickly imposed changed the law to allow them to mandatorily detain people on the basis, effectively, that, well, Cambodia was a peace process in Cambodia, Australia was part of that peace process, and if there was part of the peace process, then how could refugees actually be coming out of Cambodia in a place that Australia was involved in to try and establish peace? And I'm certainly not going to try and go into all those elements of the thing at the time, but I think you can look then at the position from then at all. If you look at the Australia's involvement in the Middle Eastern wars, its attitude to Iraqi refugees, to Afghan refugees, to the Syrian refugees, most recently, it's never been the case. That it's simply a matter of looking at people who are deserving individuals who are fleeing war and persecution and adopting a policy on the basis of that they were refugees. So I thought for this audience I'd go back a little bit as well, because I think it's not just Australia that has a problem with borders. The fact is that borders are, what's the word? I mean, they are an inevitable part. They're like implicitly connected with all capitalist states, and the borders are established there, and the way in which the different countries maintain control of their borders is seen as a way of their control, of capitalist control of a particular area, and those borders define that area. And they define that area in terms of their own control, and sometimes the way in which they exert control, beyond the borders. But even their ability to exert that control beyond the borders depends on how well they maintain the borders and police the people who are, within those borders. So it's an intrinsic element, of capitalism, the way in which they hold the borders, the way in which they control the borders. So, and that's why I think when we look at the Australian example, it's very clear that the European countries, whatever the policy they originally adopted, a couple of years ago when Syrian refugees were first coming into Europe and crossing the Mediterranean, very quickly you saw that policy to revert to putting up the fences, building the barbed wire, closing the borders, trying to force people out of countries into other countries, using Turkey then effectively as an offshore, as a place outside of the EU where refugees could be parked, and processes in Turkey to try to prevent them actually crossing boundaries. And I think it's out of that process, not just the question of the refugees, but all the things that we associated now so much with the Australian government policy, the racism, the xenophobia, the extreme nationalism. It grows out of the nationalism which is actually associated with the border, and the idea that there needs to be a defence of the border, and I'll come back to that as well. And I think that's one of the points that needs to be understood very strongly about the Refugee Convention. Like where it came from at the end of the war, mostly it was discussed, I guess, with the way in which so many countries had turned away Jewish refugees, and in the face of the kind of oppression and extermination that they were facing, the persecution they were facing in Nazi Germany and in other places progressively occupied by the Nazis, and to see countries turn away the Jewish refugees in the Second World War. It was a determination at the end of the war that we were never going to experience that again. That was really the origins of the Refugee Convention, and in that sense, one of the most crucial political aspects about it is the fact that it recognises that asylum seekers have a right to come to a border and to cross that border precisely because it's the thing which determines whether there is actually going to be political acceptance of asylum seekers and refugees or there isn't. If asylum seekers, the people fleeing war and persecution, cannot cross a border, cannot find protection on the other side of a border, then the Refugee Convention, the idea of refugees, I think is entirely diminished, substantially diminished. And I think that's why, in the context of Australia, that the issue about the arrival by boats is actually a crucial question. I mean, Australia has never had a refugee policy. It's always been a subsidiary of the Migration Act, as I said, in the first place. But I think the distinction which is made between boat arrivals and plane arrivals is something which has been so on the one hand, so contradictory and puzzling about Australia's policy, in total. But they maintain that policy because what the boats actually represent is exactly that element of the Refugee Convention which Australian governments do not like, and that is the ability of people to actually come to Australia's borders, to cross Australia's borders. It's not illegal. That's an Australian law. It's established under the Convention. The people have a right to do that, and it's why I think the refugee movement actually has to insist that a humanitarian refugee policy in Australia has to be one in which people can come to the border, and when they do come to the border, by boat or any other way, they're actually accepted. But I think they're welcomed in. I think there's another element for this particular audience. I think it's also important to understand that's the question of white Australia, because I think, again, if you want to understand why there is such embedded racism in the governments that we have, and why it finds a resonance at times in the Australian community, not all the time, and I've mentioned that about how that's been overcome as well. But I think there is a particular element of capitalist borders that I mentioned before that applies to Australia and white Australia, and a much greater concern about being a white outpost of originally European capitalism, if you like, in Asia. I think there was a very, very particular fear and concern about Australia projecting its power and its presence on the basis of British imperialism in the first place, then American imperialism, then effectively its own power in the region. And I think that's why it had, as I said, it has a particular resonance. I think those elements I mentioned before, as far as Australia is concerned. So that brings us to the question of offshore detention, because I think those two things actually come together. And I think in the case of you look at what Australia is actually doing at the moment, and the truth is it's traducing the Cambodia, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, and in some respects even New Zealand, of drawing them into a process of systematically undermining human rights and undermining the rights of refugees in the whole Asian region. And I think they have very much got away with offshore detention on the basis of Nauru and of Papua New Guinea, which effectively has enshrined and established a neo-colonial relationship. I don't think there's any way in which you can really understand how Australia has been able to dictate such brutality on Nauru and on Papua New Guinea without understanding that what is a neo-colonial relationship. Australia provides more than half of all the foreign aid to Papua New Guinea. Around $500 million a year in foreign aid goes to Papua New Guinea. They paid them another $500 million just to set up the detention centre on Manus. On Nauru, the proportions are even greater because there's actually except no resources. Even the phosphate stuff is drying up as far as Nauru is concerned. What it's also allowed them to do is to outsource the brutality. I mean, the treatment which is dished out to people who are on Manus and Nauru would be unacceptable here. I mean, we have made enormous efforts in the refugee campaign to try and get across what the kind of brutality which actually operates inside the detention centres. Not just the way in which the fences are there to divide the refugees from the rest of the population, but the petty tyrannies the rights that are denied people and systematically denied people inside the detention centres. Sometimes people are puzzled about why there are so many court cases, and that there are so many court cases because there are so many ways in which the various governments have actually tried to remove different rights, access to the courts, and so on and so forth. And we're in a particular example, I think, particular time at the moment where we're seeing a government, a Liberal government, that's absolutely determined to be as ruthless as it possibly can, both in terms of what it does domestically, trying to operate the detention centres under Operation Sovereign Borders, and with Border Force becoming an increasingly militarised operation, the detention centres are increasing. Well, in many respects, they're actually worse than prisons in terms of the rights that people have inside those places. But for all that brutality, what's actually happened on Nauru and Manus Island would not be possible, but for the fact that they are offshore, and Australia's been able to use an arm's length argument. Well, it's not us that's doing these things. It's the Nauru responsibility. It's the responsibility of Papua New Guinea. And I think that's one of the things that we've had over Manus Island at the moment. The continual insistence that the siege that being maintained around Manus Island is the responsibility of the Australian government. That nothing happens inside those detention centres. They're run, they're funded, they're administered, they're controlled, they're operated on behalf of the of the Australian government. And I think we have to continue to insist on that, to understand why it is such a shame that human rights means absolutely so little. I guess I'm running a little bit short of time, so I want to finish on two things. One, I think one of the things, in spite of the absolute horror that's happening on Manus Island at the moment, I'm kind of very pleased that we're living in the dying days of the Turnbull government. I don't think there's not much doubt about that. I think whether the election comes as soon as March, or whether it's June, or maybe they'll all be found to be foreigners, and that'll be good. There'll be a certain irony in that. Actually, but it will be. This is the dying days of the Turnbull government, and I'd like to be able to stand here and celebrate on the basis that it would be the dying days of the kind of refugee policy, of offshore detention policy, but it's not. And I think the fact is that the Labor Party, as I said earlier, enshrined mandatory detention in 1992. The truth is, in 2013, it was a Labor government that enshrined the Pacific Solution Mark II, which they then handed to a Liberal government to impose it in a particularly vicious way. And for the Labor Party has been excruciatingly silent in terms of what's happened on the offshore detention centres. They're quite happy for the mess that they created, for the brutality that was really created, by their own policy and their own initiative. They were hoping desperately, I think, that the Liberal Party would clean it up in some kind of way. It would be all fixed by the time that they got into government. It's very, very clear that the Shorten government, if that's what it is when it's created, is going to inherit Nauru and Manus Island. And the thing that they created in 2013 will be an albatross that will hang around their neck in office. So we're very, very determined to keep fighting what the Turnbull government is actually doing, and what the Abbott government did before that, as far as the detention centres are concerned. But I think we also have to sheet home that responsibility to the Labor Party. The more that they are silent in the circumstances of the brutality that's being imposed on Manus in particular, and on Nauru, the extent to which they think they can hide behind a US deal, which has got 54 people. Over a year since that deal was signed, 54 people have gone to the United States. There are many people now who actually don't want to go to the United States because of Trump. They're not interested in that, and who could blame them for that? But the idea that the US deal is going to be some solution, that's also a nonsense. There really is only one argument, and that is that whatever government is, whether it's the Turnbull government or the Shorten government, ultimately they need to bring the people to Australia, where they should have been kept in 2013, where their rights could have been protected, where they could have got the protection that they actually need. So I think in that sense, it's very much been the movement, which I think has responded fantastically to the crisis on Manus Island. I think we can, many people, as I said at the beginning, can actually see what the brutality of the years of mandatory detention and the most recent offshore processing actually means, the extent to which the Australian government is willing not just to turn a blind eye to that brutality. I think it's not a question of turning a blind eye. It is a question of very conscious, very deliberate, very determined efforts to force those people into submission, because they stand as the conscience in that respect. The thing that they hate about the people at Manus Island is that they are a constant reminder of the shame of Australia, and they stand between the ability of the Australian government to wash their hands of the brutality they imposed, and a conscience which has reminded the world that there is a deep shame to the way Australia's treated its refugees, and it's time, if we understood that shame, about why not just the Turnbull government's got to go, but the whole policy of offshore detention centres has got to go.